Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for February 6th, 2018. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about the big news that surprised us all today, and that is that Game of Thrones creators are making a series of Star Wars films. We had plans to talk about a bunch of other news, but we're throwing that all out. We're doing an emergency episode and talking about just that, but not just that, actually. We're also, in our feature presentation, we will be giving you our reaction and review of the Cloverfield Paradox, which was another surprise debut on Sunday night after the Super Bowl. This is Peter Sciretta, editor-in-chief of SlashFilm.com, and joining me on today's podcast is managing editor Jacob Hall.
Hello, hello.
Weekend editor Brad Oman.
Hello.
Senior writer Ben Pearson.
What's going on?
And writers Hoai-Tran.
Hey, everyone.
And Chris Evangelista.
Hello.
So we have the entire gang here to talk about this because this is some huge news, and that is that we are going to be getting another series of Star Wars films coming from the creators of Game of Thrones. Jacob, what do we know?
Well, last year, Lucasfilm's Kathleen Kennedy said that they had the next 10 years of Star Wars movies planned out, and they weren't kidding because David Benioff and D.B. Weiss have signed on to write and produce a new series of Star Wars movies. It's not clear if they're directing as well, but I wouldn't be surprised if they do because they did direct a few episodes of Game of Thrones. This is an interesting choice because they actually, on paper, seem like a really good fit for something like this. They know their way around intense, passionate fandoms. They know how to bring beloved fictional worlds to life. And the production of Game of Thrones is famously intense and complicated and bigger than most movies. So they already have the know-how of managing something as huge as this. So it's one of those things where they have the geek cred, they have the actual production cred. It makes sense. I know that the elephant in the room here, or the Max Rebo in the room, if you want to make a nerdy joke, is that despite all of the efforts by Kathleen Kennedy Lucasfilm to put women and people of color on screen in Star Wars, it is another two white guys, and that's disappointing. Even though I love Game of Thrones, I think they're a good fit. At the same time, like, oh, it's a little obvious. So I'm going to throw it out to you guys, Game of Thrones fans or not. Does this news sound like good to you? Because I'm so torn. I love Game of Thrones. I love these guys. I think they make great television. They're smart. They're funny. They have good storytelling instincts. But do we need more white male Star Wars storytelling? What do you guys think?
You know, I'm going to start this out because I feel like I'm going to be the dissenting opinion on this. I'm not a huge fan of Game of Thrones. I know most of the people on the staff and in the world are. So I know I am in the minority here. So this news doesn't get me as excited as hearing, Rian Johnson is doing a trilogy of Star Wars films, which, by the way, is, unconnected to this. Which is also another thing worth talking about is, now that we're going to get 3 Rian Johnson Star Wars films, we're going to get a series of these Star Wars films. Did they say a trilogy or just a series?
Just series. They don't specify a trilogy.
A series. That's probably at least 5, if not 6 movies right there. Does that mean that the Skywalker saga is going to be over after 9? And does that mean the standalone stories are going to be over after Solo? Because it seems like, with 6 movies, they have themselves planned out well into the the next decade, and also one of my complaints about the current Skywalker saga Star Wars films, which I know any listener of the podcast has heard me complain about, is that they are kind of auteur driven. They are bringing a filmmaker in for each episode, and they are not doing much in terms of long-term planning. So there's not like an overall story arc. It's interesting to me that Kathleen Kennedy has hired Rian Johnson to, write and direct a trilogy of Star Wars films, and also, these guys to plan a series. So it feels to me that she might be feeling that, serialized storytelling on a grander scale of planning it out might be the way to go in the future. But yes, not having the love for Game of Thrones, I know, I know everybody out there loves these guys, but let me just remind you, one of them wrote X-Men Origins Wolverine, and yeah. But you know what? At least hire Michelle McLaren to direct one of these one of these movies. Like, you know, she is a mainstay on Game of Thrones. Get a woman, a female director in there. But let me go to one of the huge Game of Thrones fans, Ben. What is your thoughts on this big news?
I am sort of right there with Jacob in that I love the capabilities that these guys have, but I also am a little hesitant in terms of what it says about the Star Wars franchise in general and the behind the scenes decisions that are happening. I mean, they're definitely an interesting choice, and like you said, Peter, there is the possibility that they get a female director to come in. Although I wouldn't necessarily call Michelle McLaren a mainstay in Game of Thrones. I think she's probably only directed like 4 episodes in the history of the show, and that was in the early seasons of the show. And she was the only female director, as far as I know, to ever be on Game of Thrones, and that's a show that's been going for almost a decade. So it's not exactly...
That shows my Game of Thrones knowledge.
Well, I mean, she's wildly capable as a filmmaker in her own right, and actually she's directing Chris Pratt in Cowboy Ninja Viking. We talked about that just a few days ago. So I wonder what that's going to do if she theoretically, you know, even if she's interested in this, what the timing will look like when all of this shakes out. But yeah, I mean, as you pointed out, the idea of this being specifically labeled a series and not a trilogy is sort of fascinating to me. It's also interesting that they don't specifically say in the official announcement that came out of StarWars.com today that, you know, what kind of movies these are going to be. When Rian Johnson's trilogy was announced, they specifically said that Johnson will introduce new characters from a corner of the galaxy that Star Wars lore has never before explored. And they don't have any details like that in the announcement that came out today about Benioff and Weiss's new series. So does that mean that these guys are theoretically, maybe they're going to be writing like an Obi-Wan movie or something like that? So maybe the idea that the standalone movies are coming to an end after Solo is not necessarily set in stone. I don't know. There's a lot to sort of parse here, but I'm interested more than anybody else in what the one non-white guy on this podcast thinks. So I want to throw this to HT and see what she thinks about all this.
So I kind of hate this news. I used to be a really ardent Game of Thrones fan, but I really dislike the direction that D&D took with the series, starting with season 3 and on. And I think that they're just not good writers. When it came to adapting the first few seasons of Game of Thrones, at risk of this turning into a sort of Game of Thrones rant, they had... they're really good when it came to being faithful to George R. R. Martin's narrative and kind of creating and generating really pulpy and exciting moments, along with some really interesting character dynamics between characters like Cersei and Robert, or Arya and Tywin. But then in later seasons, when they veered off from the source material even more, the series started transforming into sort of nihilistic nonsense verging on fan service. And I think that they relied heavily on the nudity and shock factor that comes with HBO series, and kind of in turn use that as a placeholder for actual plot building and earned storytelling. So I am not a big fan of them. I dread to see what they bring to a Star Wars franchise, especially with me. Star Wars has always been a optimistic, really hopeful series, and bringing these Game of Thrones creators in kind of sort of catalogs the direction that Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm are trying to bring Star Wars into, which I feel like is the gritty, grim version that we've seen in Rogue One. And I don't know if I really want that, especially with Rogue One being such a contradiction of things. And I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't like this news, and I don't think that they were the best choice for a new Star Wars series.
I disagree with you so much, HT.
I'm sorry?
I disagree with you so much. I don't want to turn this into a Game of Thrones show, but maybe in a future episode, you and I can throw down about Game of Thrones.
Well, I just have a lot of issues with their writing of female characters in particular, and their overt use of rape and sexual assault on women. So
Is that them or George?
It's both.
It's both, but they definitely bring it more to the forefront of things. And I think that they miss out on a lot of the nuance that even George R. R. Martin portrayed in his books, and they kind of place women into these really sort of these really simple categories.
Yeah. I kind of wonder if they are hired because of their talents, or if it is maybe a direction that Star Wars wants to go in. Do you think, Star Wars has always been based off fantasy tropes in a sci-fi world, but do you think, they might be going to the Knights of the Old Republic kind of timeline? If you're going to go into that kind of world, maybe these kind of guys are the kind of guys you want to get to tell a story in that era of the Star Wars galaxy. We haven't heard from Chris yet. Chris, what are your thoughts?
I actually agree with pretty much almost everything HT said. I don't care for Game of Thrones, honestly. I liked it when it started, and then I just sort of got sick of it. I got sick of it because, to me, that show is literally like misery porn, and I'm miserable enough, as everyone knows, that I don't need I don't need a show to make me more. It just seems like that show is on an arc where anytime there's a slightly likable character, they're instantly going to die, and I don't have time.
Dead.
Yeah, I don't have time for that in my life right now. Like I said, I'm miserable enough, so I sort of gave up on the show, and this just seems like really obvious to me. It's so obvious it's boring that they picked these guys. Oh, these guys have already worked in a fantasy medium, let's just get them for Star Wars. That's such a uninspired choice. There's a world of creative people out there they could hire to do this, and to just go to the Game of Thrones guys it's such a dull, boring choice. I don't like it. When they announced the new Rian Johnson trilogy, I was excited because I think Rian Johnson is an interesting voice. And that was even before I saw The Last Jedi, and I love The Last Jedi, so I'm even more excited now. But the Game of Thrones guys do nothing for me. I mean, maybe I'll change my tune once I see what they're doing, but for now, this is boring news to me.
You're all crazy. I'm taking crazy pills here.
I think it's also interesting that this is the second time we've seen sort of a major sort of studio trying to get in on that Game of Thrones hype. We've seen it with Amazon starting developing their own Lord of the Rings series to sort of try to mirror the Game of Thrones big budget, high fantasy hype that HBO has generated.
Yeah, and we should go to our own Brad Oman to get his humorous opinion on this late-breaking news.
Listen, for all those people who have always wanted to see what a relationship between Luke and Leia would have been like, this is the best choice for a future. I think that maybe this new series of movies will just be an alternate timeline of the original trilogy, and Luke and Leia will get together. Han and Chewie will also be together, and it'll be a whole new thing. It's gonna be really exciting, guys. I don't know what you're talking about.
I was gonna joke that we would get the first Star Wars movie where everybody dies, but that already happened.
No, funnily enough, I think I'm kind of right in the middle of HT and Chris and Jacob and Ben. I keep up with Game of Thrones and I watch it, but I'm not in love with it. Most of the time, I won't watch it when it's live. I watch it like the next day or even 2 days later. I'm not in a rush to see where it's going, but I'm interested in the story and seeing what they do with the characters. More recently, since the series has started to divert from what has already been revealed in the books, I have become less interested and invested, but I don't downright hate it. I think, if anything, the only reason I'm not against this news is because I think I like the idea of having more separate series of Star Wars movies that have nothing to do with the Skywalkers and have zero narrative connections to anything else that has happened in the galaxy, because I just want to expand. And I feel like bringing these two guys in could take Star Wars in a different direction, not just narratively, but also maybe stylistically. And even though I kind of agree with what HT said about, what Star Wars represents and the spirit of Star Wars and that kind of thing, I don't think every Star Wars movie needs to have all of those traits. That's, I think that we're kind of starting to limit what Star Wars can be, as opposed to thinking about where it can go and the different areas we can venture to in the galaxy. You know, not everything that exists in the Star Wars galaxy has to be have, you know, uplifting moments and a little bit of hope and that kind of thing. I would like it if we started to divert stylistically more from the original trilogy and just make different stories that happen to be set in the Star Wars universe, as opposed to movies that are a slave to the formula that, you know, George Lucas kind of accidentally created after the original Star Wars was such a hit. So I'm not necessarily sure these two guys are the best ones to do it. I would have been much more interested if Reed Morano was the one who ended up getting hired to do a Star Wars movie, especially, you know, after seeing what she can do with a movie like I Think We're Alone Now at Sundance, which was something that I was lukewarm on, but it also proved to me that, like, she can do some impressive things, you know, behind the camera. So yeah, I think I'm just right in the middle, and I'm not excited one way or the other. I think I'm more so just interested in, like, okay, let's see what new venues we can explore in the Star Wars galaxy.
She still might be able to come on and direct this, because like Jacob said, we aren't 100% sure that they're going to be directing. So maybe that's a combination that'll end up happening. That'd be kind of cool.
Yeah, that's true.
I want to build off something that Brad said about Star Wars being multiple things, and these guys are, you know, their previous work has been darker than Star Wars usually has. So I'm just going to throw this out there to the table. What if this is the old Boba Fett project that Josh Trank was going to do, and they hired them because they need somebody who's comfortable doing scumbag characters? Just throwing it out there.
I don't know. I think you know, I don't love Game of Thrones enough to offer opinion here, so maybe someone else.
If they have a whole series of films set in, like, the more seedy side of the Star Wars universe, then I think that could be kind of interesting. I'm not necessarily on board for a Boba Fett movie because I don't need to know any more about that character. He's fine just where he is. But if it's something that deals with, you know, like a group of bounty hunters, or like something along the lines of that live action Star Wars series that was once in development, or was it a video game? I forget. The one that was kind of set in, like, the underbelly.
Well, both were going to be set in the underbelly.
Yeah, was that 3113 or something?
That was a video game, yes.
Okay, yeah. So I think a series of movies, you know, set in a world like that, where we see kind of like the criminal underworld of Star Wars, kind of like I don't know, I guess a Star Wars Boardwalk Empire or something like that would be kind of interesting.
I mean, I think that would be interesting for a TV series, but I'm not sure if I want a movie. I don't know.
Tell that to The Godfather.
Ben, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I'm sort of interested in what HT and Chris, as the dissenting opinion have holders in this podcast episode, what they think about maybe what a new Star Wars series could or should look like. HT, I know you
especially
mentioned
coming
that,
from these two guys.
Well, yeah, these two guys, or if they, these guys as the architects of it, but conceivably, you know, being able to pull in all sorts of different people to direct the work that they're writing and producing. You guys have any, you know, even with them, even not being thrilled at the decision that these guys have been hired, do you have any hopes for what future Star Wars movies can be in this separate series?
I will say that D&D, the good thing I'll say about them is that they're really good at creating a really talented and rich team of people who can build richly imagined worlds like the one we see in Game of Thrones. So they can conduct, I think, they can lead, I think, a good team to create this world, whatever it may be. And I'm not really sure what I would assume it to be at, because there are just no details coming toward it. I do think that since their brand so much is that gritty and grim vibe we see with Game of Thrones, we're probably going to see a more seedy underbelly, like you guys were saying. I'm not interested in a Boba Fett movie because Boba Fett is not an interesting character to me. I'm sorry, Star Wars fans. But yeah, I mean, I could see them, I guess, going with something more political intrigue, maybe. Maybe that would be interesting, although we saw a little bit of that with the prequels, and that was the opposite of fun. So I have no idea.
I mean, it just seems so strange to me that we heard Kathleen Kennedy after all, the kind of failures in development, the Josh Tranks, the Lord and Millers, the, Gareth Edwards reshoots. We heard that she was not looking at people that didn't have a lot of experience. She wanted to go after, writers and filmmakers that have a lot of experience. I'm not saying that these guys don't have a lot of experience. They have a lot of experience in TV, and I think in a way that's probably good because it shows they can accomplish something under a tighter budget and a tighter time schedule. But they certainly don't have a lot of experience writing big films. They are for the most part adapting.
Experience with 80-hour films.
Well, they're adapting this from a source material. I know that a lot of what they've done in the last season is going off of not going off the source material, but they have something to go off of. Here, it's creating everything from. I mean, I guess not everything from scratch because George Lucas created this world, but I guess I don't know. It's just interesting. So I guess, Chris, what kind of story would they have to make to get you interested?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I do love the idea of opening up this universe. One of the things that's disappointed me about the anthology films is they just keep telling the same story we already know over and over again. So I am interested in, exploring this universe. There's an entire, galaxy out there they can explore. So, it's a wait and see thing. I'm not particularly inspired by this choice, but that could change. It depends on what director they're going to hire. Depends on what story they want to tell. It doesn't even. It all depends on where they're taking it. I don't have anything I'm against, so I'll put it that way. But I just wish it were different people.
I guess. The last question is, Jacob, you are probably the biggest fan of Game of Thrones on the staff. What would you like to see these guys tackle in the Star Wars universe?
I'm actually going to say I want them to tackle something that is outside their wheelhouse. I mean, we talked about them being grim and gritty. I even brought the idea of doing a criminal underworld thing. But after a decade of Game of Thrones and doing that nihilistic dark fantasy, part of me is wondering what it would look like if these two said, let's leave that behind and make something fun and adventurous and pulpy, more along the lines of the original Star Wars from 77. So I don't want this to be Game of Thrones in space. I want this to be them taking their wildest dreams of what Star Wars can be and doing something new with it. That's why I love Last Jedi so much. It's Rian Johnson being handed the reins to Star Wars and saying, this is my personal Star Wars. This is what it means to me. So I hope they weren't hired to just do the same thing. I hope they were hired to really swing for the fences and do something that is as different from Game of Thrones as possible. As much as I love Game of Thrones, I don't necessarily need that dressed up in Star Wars clothes.
Okay, then I think we have covered most of it until we learn more on what this project is and when we can see it. It's just going to be all speculation, and I'm sure we will love to speculate, but we'll do that at a later time. Jacob, I'm going to let you go because you have not seen the Cloverfield Paradox. Do you feel left out?
No, everybody tells me it's terrible.
Well, we'll dive into that shortly. Jacob, thanks for joining us.
Of course. Talk to you guys later.
Okay, so during the Super Bowl, it was announced that the new Cloverfield movie, the third in the series, was coming out. It was called Cloverfield Paradox, and it was released right after the big game on Netflix. Fans everywhere rushed to their TVs and rushed to that Netflix app and watched the movie. We talked about some of the reactions, the first reactions yesterday, but we have all gotten together and seen the movie. So I guess we're going to start off quickly with our brief spoiler-free reactions before giving a little bit more, because I'm assuming most of the people listening to this probably care about this and have watched the movie or just want to hear our reactions before tuning out. So let's start this off with Chris, who wrote the review for the site. In space, no one can hear you screw up a franchise.
Yeah, I was very excited about this. I was excited about it even before they announced it was arriving right after the Super Bowl, because I love the Cloverfield franchise. I love the first two films. So I was hyped, and then I watched it, and boy, was I disappointed. It was just, it was a very poorly pieced together something. I don't even. This barely qualifies as a movie to me. It's just like an idea someone had, and then they quickly shot a bunch of scenes, and this is what we ended up with.
Okay, HT, what did you think?
I actually didn't think it was that bad. I was. Well, I won't say I was thoroughly entertained for the entirety of the film, but I was on board with the film for at least the first maybe 2/3 of it. And I thought that it was a really, at moments, it was a really gripping sci-fi thriller that, hit all the marks for what a space horror film could be for me. And there were moments where it kind of sabotaged itself by inserting the subplot that tied in the rest of the Cloverfield franchise back on Earth. But I think that the scenes on the spaceship, or the whatever the space center they're at, were really good, and that the cast was great for the most part. Well, the cast was great, but the scenes for the most part were good. And I enjoyed it, and I don't think it was that terrible up until the end, when I think it kind of undercut itself with an ending that really.
Well, we can talk about the ending a little bit later.
Yes.
We'll talk about that. I'll give my quick reaction before I get to more people. I felt, it felt badly edited. It felt badly shot. It felt derivative. I love some of the ideas that are at the core of the film. I feel like with a different filmmaker and a different screenwriter, this could have been something special. The Cloverfield stuff does feel kind of badly executed, almost like an afterthought, almost like as if they threw it in there after the fact in reshoots and editing, which I'm willing to bet happened. There's only a couple moments in the film that I was like, wow, this is a cool moment. We could talk about those in spoilers. But let's go to Ben. Ben, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I also did not really care for this movie. I, like Chris, really enjoyed the cast and was excited about it because I love the first two movies. 10 Cloverfield Lane was like on my top 10 of 2016. So I'm a big fan of this franchise. But where that movie, I think, worked almost on its own until the very end, where it basically functions as a completely self-sustained story until it opens up, and the wild ending of that movie sort of ties it into the Cloverfield Cloververse, I guess. This one, I don't think it stands on its own well enough to function as not only a part of this franchise, but just as a movie period. It's very, as Peter already mentioned, derivative, and the characters, as good as Gugu Mbatha Raw is in one of the lead roles, she takes this so seriously and has such a way of generating empathy for her character that I sort of felt for her in spite of how ridiculous the movie was becoming around her. But I think this movie starts out really well. I was totally on board with it, and then it just crashes and burns to the point where it just becomes unredeemable. But yeah, Brad, what did you think about it?
Yeah, I liked it more than I thought I would, based on some of the reactions and things like that. I think the characters are probably the worst part. They're all pretty two-dimensional, and they only serve to move the plot forward or create suspicion or create situations where you're worried about them getting hurt, but they don't give you enough of a character to actually care when they do get hurt or when they're in peril or something like that. But I like the idea. I like the story of the paradox itself and what how the dimensions work and how it creates this kind of a situation where anything could happen to any of them at any moment because of how they cross the timeline. And I think that all the stuff that happens back on Earth feels tacked on, almost as if this were a separate movie that was forced into becoming a Cloverfield movie by creating that direct connection to what we've seen before. And I think we could have done without that, or at least could have done with maybe something a little more subtle than what ended up on screen. I didn't hate it. I enjoyed it. I liked the cast, and I wish it was better. I think that there's probably a lot that ended up getting cut out in favor of making a faster movie that's a little easier to digest because of the science of it all. But yeah, I didn't hate it as much as other people have. It definitely feels better than a VOD movie, but not quite as good as what I would have wanted to see from a Cloverfield movie, especially after how good 10 Cloverfield Lane was.
Yeah, they don't explain much of the science in this movie, and they and I don't think they ever intended to. You know what? HDD, do you want to say something?
Oh, I think that if they had went further into the explanation for the science, it would have definitely got bogged down even more with exposition.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it does almost feel like technobabble at points where you're just like, okay, I guess that's what's happening. Sort of like a TV episode of Doctor Who or Star Trek.
Yeah, okay. I think at this point we need to get into spoilers. So if you have not seen the Cloverfield Paradox or, want to stay spoiler-free, you might want to tune out right now because we are going to get into it. So, I guess where should we start? Chris, let's get into spoilers.
Okay, well, Jesus.
Where do you begin?
Are we making you relive your trauma, Chris?
You know what? Before Chris gets into spoilers, I just want to say the beginning of this movie is like one of the worstly edited things I've ever seen. It like reminded me of a student film. They're like trying to show the people on the shuttle or the space station like time has gone by, but like they're talking, we can't hear them. Like it's the
I actually liked that. That was like that was the one part of the movie I liked.
I like that too.
I thought it was clever because rather than bogging us down with exposition and the mundane elements, it's being like, all right, let's get you to the point of the story you need to be by sort of blowing through the quote unquote boring stuff.
See, I like that in theory, but I feel like I'm judging more the execution than the idea of it.
I mean, this movie is terribly directed. It's just Dutch angles everywhere. For some reason, every angle in this movie is a Dutch angle, and I don't understand that. So I can understand. So that doesn't help things. The biggest spoiler of this movie is it ties itself directly to the first Cloverfield, which is also the biggest mistake this movie makes. The cool thing about the Cloverfield franchise, at least from my opinion, is the films didn't have to tie to each other. I always thought of Cloverfield as sort of like just a brand name, sort of like how the episodes of the Twilight Zone, they don't tie together. They're just all Twilight Zone episodes. And that's what I wanted the Cloverfield franchise to be. Like the films don't actually have to reference each other. They're just all under this Cloverfield brand. But for some reason, they thought it would be wise to make this film tie directly into the first film. And I don't like it. All the stuff on Earth is deliberately referencing, I guess, the first Cloverfield. I can't tell if it's supposed to be. Sorry, go ahead.
One of our readers, Sade Glover, wrote in from San Leandro, California, said, I just finished Cloverfield Paradox on Netflix, and I have a question. When does this movie take place? Is this before the first Cloverfield? Love the podcast. So our own Ben Pearson wrote a whole article explaining the connections of this movie. So I feel like before we get into this, Ben, why don't you give us a lesson on how this connects? Because I think a lot of people are confused because this takes place, seems like, 10 years from now, but the real original Cloverfield took place 10 years ago. Like, I don't even understand the connections.
Yeah, so I'll try to keep it short. We see at the very, very end of this movie is a monster that looks very similar to the original Cloverfield monster, sort of bursting forth above the cloud line as the space capsule falls back through the clouds in the deep distance. So I think a lot of people are confused, thinking that this is the astronauts are returning to the same time period, like 2008, that the first movie took place. But I think what actually is happening here is that the particle accelerator event that is depicted in this movie is essentially like the Big Bang of the Cloververse. It's an event that causes a rip in the membrane of space-time, as Donald Logue's scientist character says on a screen in the beginning of this movie.
And I think he even says it could affect not only the now, but the future and the past.
Yes, exactly. So future and the past, and I think it is essentially like the equivalent of a wormhole opening up and these alien creatures coming in from different dimensions and sort of just being dropped into different points on the timeline. And it's important that they say the future and the past because this movie takes place in 2028, so that's the future. We know that from the ARG campaign for the Cloverfield Paradox, and then it's also important for the past because not only for the events that we saw in 10 Cloverfield Lane and the original Cloverfield, but also for the upcoming Cloverfield 4, which is called Overlord, and that one is set in World War II. So I think this specific event, this particle accelerator event that we saw, that is like ground zero, and like everything sort of spreads out from there. So I think each Cloverfield movie thus far has taken place in a different dimension and or a different timeline, I guess if you want to call it that. And the aliens or creatures or what have you made their way into those dimensions or timelines because of what happens in this movie.
So what you're saying is, the events of this movie caused all of this to happen, but this is not the same Earth as Cloverfield or Cloverfield Lane.
Right.
It's kind of confusing. It's interesting. It's because I think a lot of people, they saw Cloverfield and they saw that that end scene where they're in Coney Island and there's this thing that falls from the sky, which I think was later revealed in the ARG to be like a satellite.
Yeah,
and some people were seeing this movie and thinking that was a piece of the space station or that was them coming home. I don't know. It's very confusing. It's very they don't explain a lot, and
it's what I would call poorly written is what I would call it. That's
okay. HT, before you wanted to talk about the ending of this movie and your dislike of the ending, let's get on it.
Yeah, the ending was very, like everyone was saying, it's very tacked on. And I think not only does it feel like it's shoehorned in to sort of put this movie under the Cloverfield umbrella, but it also undercuts the emotional payoff that we see at the end, which we see Hamilton and Volkov, Hamilton and Schmidt escaping the space station and getting home. And I think we assume that they're eaten by the monster at the end, and that was something that really angered me and was something that almost felt like the film was trolling me in a way, like that was very disrespectful, I think, to a viewer and to the audience. So I really dislike that, and I think that whatever was working in the film up until then just kind of immediately lost its strength after that ending. And I will say I think that there are parts of this movie that did work because I really liked the surprising humor that was in the movie. That mostly came from Chris O'Dowd, like the scene where he asks his arm after it gets cut off, "What do you mean, arm?" I laughed. It was hilarious. But yeah, there are glimmers of greatness in this movie. And I think if it had been tweaked a little bit more, it could have been a good film, but it just ended up being sort of an incoherent mess.
Brad, what do you have to say about the film now that we're in spoilers?
Yeah, the ending is definitely confusing because I was also under the impression that they were returning to an Earth where the Cloverfield monster had been unleashed, and it was like somehow back in 2007, 2008 when the original movie was set. I don't dislike the idea of them, kind of having to deal with the fact they're coming back to an Earth where there's these monsters around. But at the same time, that idea almost feels like it's better served in a TV series where if that was the series finale, that would be an interesting setup for like a new season of a TV show. Be like, oh, okay, so now these two have to try and survive on Earth with these monsters around, and, Hamilton has to try and find her husband and da-da-da-da-da. But otherwise, it's almost like it's a gimmicky Twilight Zone ending almost that doesn't entirely, it's not really earned. But
it's not even clever because Donald Logue basically says, like, he teased it up early in the film, and I'm like, oh, that's what the ending's going to be.
Yeah. I just, I think I'm mostly disappointed in some aspects of this movie because there's so many cool ideas and things in it that just aren't explained very well and would have made for an interesting, a more compelling sci-fi movie. Like the whole thing with Chris O'Dowd's arm, is great. Like, I feel like I would have been more interested in a movie where they had to try and figure out how to more easily communicate with themselves or the other people that were on the mission in the other dimension in order to figure out how to get back or save each other's worlds. I think that would have been far more engaging to try and figure out, but it would have required a lot of probably explanation and exposition. But without that, you know, does it make any sense why the gyrosphere or whatever the hell that thing was in Volkov's body? Like, why? Do we any explanation of that whatsoever?
I don't think so.
There was there was an episode of Fringe that sort of delves into this. I'm going to play up the underrated Fringe love. So Fringe, there's an episode where it deals with multiple dimensions and where these two dimensions are colliding with each other, much like they do in the Cloverfield Paradox. And we're seeing, because of that, a lot of body horror, a lot of things combining that aren't supposed to be combining. So like we see with the sudden emergence of items from people's bodies, or the worms appearing suddenly in Volkov. So it's just like it's interesting because like that episode of Fringe does it so well in that little 45 minutes, but here it only comes off as sort of an afterthought, like, oh, this is something that could happen as a result of the Cloverfield Paradox. But they kind of just brushed aside, and I think that was something that would have been really fascinating to delve into, especially with the emergence of Elizabeth Debicki's character, and she kind of like being in the walls and that body horror of the wires and pipes going through her body, and they kind of just drop it after a while, and it's something that could be easily explained and also would make for much more compelling sci-fi storytelling.
Yeah, and she and Chris O'Dowd, who loses a freaking arm in this movie, are both like almost instantly back to normal and don't really react to the idea that they've just underwent, you know, severe traumatic things that just happened to them. The characters in this movie, to me, are like just one step above the people in Prometheus. Like, these are some of the dumbest scientist characters that I've seen in a long time. It takes them so long to realize that they have, you know, gone into an alternate dimension, and it's like they heard the same news broadcast that we did, so the audience instantly knows what's happening, and it takes them like an extra what feels like 10 or 15 minutes to sort of catch up to it. So it's just a really frustrating movie. And I think sort of along the lines of what HT was saying, where you know, they pick up this interesting idea and then just immediately drop the ball. It sort of goes along with the ending of the movie as well. It's like the first Cloverfield movie ends in a pretty dark way. Like, everybody dies in that movie. All these characters that you just spent this entire film with and learned to love and care about are dead, and there's nothing you can do about it. And 10 Cloverfield Lane, you've spent this whole time with Mary Elizabeth Winstead's character, and she finally escapes only to realize that her life is screwed because there's all these alien creatures flying around, and she barely makes it out alive, but it's not a great situation that she's in. So the idea of the move of them crashing back to Earth and coming back to a place that is significantly different than what they're expecting, and probably way worse off with monsters walking around, sort of feels thematically in line with what the Cloverfield movies have done before. But the execution of it, like Chris was saying, is just so lazy and boring that it just it lands with a thud instead of like an oh shit moment, you know?
Yeah, I really wish they got more into these ideas with the different dimensions. You know, I love what they did in Fringe, which is J.J. Abrams' produced show. And, you know, there was a movie at Sundance a few years ago, or not a few years ago, 7 years ago now, called Another Earth, which was directed by Mike Cahill and stars Britt Marling of the OA fame. And it was about the discovery of another Earth. And it was an interesting character drama. But, like, I think there's a lot to be done there in sci-fi that isn't being done. You know, I wanted to rant that I know we were talking about Star Wars, and, you know, my rant that, you know, they aren't doing enough to make it the planning and serialization of that series. Like, I feel like, you know, they're just doing it episode by episode, and that is really annoying to me as a fan who wants, like, kind of a story arc that feels like from the first episode to the end, feels kind of like it was built up and paid off on. This series, the Cloverfield series, feels even worse because to me, and I know J.J. Abrams gets this, a lot of people like to knock J.J. Abrams. I'm actually a J.J. Abrams fan, but, a lot of people like to knock, Lost for doing this, for kind of setting up a premise and not having a plan. And, but I think with this Cloverfield series, it's like that, it's all the complaints against J.J. times 100 or 1,000, because they are basically making these movies as if they are a regular movie, and then like being like, let's make them a Cloverfield movie after the fact. 10 Cloverfield Lane, no matter what you say about that, that was what the movie was when it was shot. Do you know what I mean? Like, they didn't make it into a Cloverfield movie. They might have, titled it 10 Cloverfield Lane, and that might have been J.J. Abrams' plan all along. But this film, from what I understand, and from what we're seeing, was not shot as a Cloverfield movie. A lot of these connections were all added in post-production. It seems lazy. Like, it seems like if you're gonna... I like Black Mirror, and I kind of love the idea of I wish Black Mirror... I know they have these Easter eggs that kind of connect some of the episodes and stuff. I kind of wish that we kind of, as the show goes on, realize that it all takes place in one world with the same corporation. Do you know what I mean? Like, we sometimes have characters that we've seen before, and I feel like that showrunner is so resistant to that, and I totally understand that he wants to make it episode by episode. If you're going to do Cloverfield movies and you are going to have them be connected, then fucking plan it out. And tell the director before he makes the movie that he's making a Cloverfield movie, and the writers too. Let's let the writers in on it so that that they can actually make something that's comprehensible.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not a crazy suggestion, Peter. I think that's like a pretty basic thing that they could definitely do. But it seems, I don't know. It's like they take these smaller budget movies that maybe they don't think that they don't think are financially viable on their own, and then just slap the Cloverfield brand on them. And I think they've done it twice so far, and it worked once, and it definitely didn't this time. So it's just a matter of whether they're going to continue on with that being their method of making these movies, or if they are going to actually try to put some more time into them in the earlier stages. Because I think the later the later they acquire these things and then retrofit them, I feel like the worse off everything is going to be.
Yeah, I was going to say, while we were on this podcast, the Wrap reported that Paramount is still releasing J.J. Abrams' Overlord, despite the Cloverfield Paradox Netflix deal. I think that might be the first movie in this franchise, other than their original 2008 Cloverfield, that the director and the writers might actually have known that it was going to be a Cloverfield movie. So I'm wondering if that movie is going to be called Overlord, or if it's going to actually be released as a Cloverfield movie after this
Cloverlord.
Cloverlord. But it seems, I don't know. What do you guys think about the future of this Cloverfield franchise? Do you think like it should be what Chris is saying? It should be, episode by episode. It should be like the Twilight Zone and not have any connection whatsoever. I kind of like the idea that they explained why everything's happening, but the whole rest of the movie was just such a disaster, and that explanation felt so tacked on, and it didn't feel organic to the story at all.
Yeah. Brad, do you have any thoughts?
I think I'd like to see David Benioff and D.B. Weiss create a whole new series of Cloverfield movies separate from the Cloverfield saga.
Okay.
And also still with incest, just so everyone's on the same page.
Great.
Before we go, I think we probably all said what we wanted to say about this movie. Oh, I do want to say I loved the sequence where she's stuck in that section and it fills up with water and then it cracks.
I was going to mention that too.
Yeah, it freezes. That was such cool imagery. Like, I wish it was in a better movie.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I wrote that down actually as one positive thing to say about this movie, because that part was something that I haven't really seen before. I thought that was really imaginative and really well executed.
I just wish this cast was in a better movie. I really like this cast, and I love how diverse and how talented each of these actors are, but they were really wasted in this movie, despite some really interesting moments and that they had.
And we should also mention every Cloverfield movie has some kind of connections and Easter eggs and cameos. Slusho is in all of these. I think it's pretty obvious in this one. There's some cameos in 10 Cloverfield Lane, like Bradley Cooper's on the phone and stuff like that. Chris, you wrote up an article on the site detailing 2 not-so-secret Cloverfield Paradox cameos. Tell us about them.
So right at the beginning of the movie, there's a news reporter on the radio, and I actually didn't catch this when I watched it, but that is the voice of Simon Pegg, who is, of course, in multiple J.J. Abrams films. He was in Mission Impossible 3. He was in Star Wars: The Force Awakens. He was in the Star Trek films. And then the other one is a Bad Robot staple. Greg Grunberg he's the guy who's basically like the NASA mission control guy who keeps talking to both everyone on the space station and the main character's husband as well. So he keeps basically talking to everyone in the film. And so, they're voice cameos.
He's in almost every one of J.J. Abrams. I think he's in every one of the films directed by J.J. Abrams. I think they went to kindergarten together. They've been lifelong friends. And I almost wonder if he's going to be in Star Wars Episode 9, because he was in Force Awakens, but I'm guessing Snap Wexley died, because we don't see him in 8. But maybe he was on a mission somewhere else. I don't know. Whatever. Anyways, is there any other things that people notice that they want to mention before we go?
Even though this isn't the Abrams movie, they still snuck in the Kelvin reference to J.J. Abrams' grandfather. The gas station that you can see in the opening scene is called Kelvin. The gas
station in Cloverfield Lane is also called Kelvin. And it's also featured in Super 8, I think?
Yeah, Super 8. And then I saw a Kelvin sticker somewhere on one of the doors in the Cloverfield space station as well.
Yeah, there are a few other examples like that I screenshotted and put in my articles. So if you guys are looking for even more connections, you can check that out at slashfilm.com.
Yeah, and you can read Chris's full review on slashfilm.com. I'll link it in the show notes, and also his article on the cameos in the film as well. We have so many people on here. I'm not sure if let's just say where we can find you on Twitter. Brad Oman.
At Ethan_Anderton.
Ben.
At Ben Pears.
HT.
At H-Tran Bowie.
Chris.
At C Evangelista 413.
You can find more of all the stories we mentioned today, including the big Star Wars news, on slashfilm.com. You can find this podcast, Slash Film Daily, published every weekday on iTunes, Google Play, Overcast, all the popular podcast apps. Please feel free and send us your feedback, questions, comments, concerns to peter@slashfilm.com. We might mention them on the air. And please go rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Spread the word. Tell your friends. We'll see you tomorrow.